Good afternoon and welcome to today's Regulatory Transparency Project webinar. Department of Government Efficiency, Opportunities and Challenges is what we'll be discussing today. We're glad you're all here. My name is Marie Blanchard and I'm the Assistant Director of the Regulatory Transparency Project at the Federalist Society. We're pleased to have with us a stellar panel of experts, and just as a note, as always, the opinions expressed are those of the experts. In order to get right to the discussion, I'll hand it off to our moderator, Susan Dudley. Susan is the founder of the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University, and she is a distinguished professor of practice at the School of Public Policy there as well. And to find out more about our moderator, Susan, and the speakers today, please go to fedsoc.org. And with that, I'll hand it off to you, Susan. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Marie, and thanks to the Regulatory Transparency Project for hosting this. The week before Christmas, I'm seeing a lot of people in attendance. So there's a lot of interest in this topic of the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, that President Trump has assigned to entrepreneurs Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Trump has said that they will cut federal regulation down to size. And they've said one of the ways they'll do that is through drastic cuts in regulation. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to focus more on the regulatory side of things. I'll just say, I think there is room for regulations to be more efficient and less burdensome. By any measure, the scope and size of the regulatory state has been growing probably for the last half century, regardless of the president in power. And agencies tend to layer regulation upon regulation without stopping to evaluate whether they're actually achieving the desired effects. So I, for one, want DOGE to succeed. But as I wrote in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last week, the discussion reminds me a little bit of Seinfeld, where the president will issue executive orders. Or they'll make recommendations, executive orders will be issued, and yada, 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 smaller government. So what this panel, these experts that we have, will talk about is try to fill in that yada, 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 to talk about what might work and what might not. So both Professor Nick Bagley and Professor Chris Walker are professors of law at the University of Michigan School of Law. They're both widely published, and both have recently written about DOGE. Nick in The Atlantic and Chris in a series of tweets that's probably more sophisticated than most of us in our other writing. And they both have very impressive resumes. And I encourage you to go, as Marie said, to the RTP site or to the University of Michigan site. So I'll just say very briefly that Nick served as special counsel and then chief counsel to Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And Chris has worked in all three branches of government, and relevant for this audience, in 2022, he won the Federalist Society Joseph Story Award given to young academics who demonstrate excellence in scholarship, teaching, and public service. So before I turn to you both, I'm just going to start with some observations. First, even though it's being called a Department of Government Efficiency, it's not really a department. Apparently, Musk and Ramaswamy will be uncompensated private citizens serving in an advisory role. Now, in their Wall Street Journal op-ed, they said, we are assisting the Trump transition team to identify and hire a lean team of government crusaders, or small government crusaders. And that raises a question that I would love to have Chris and Nick talk about, perhaps, is whether they'll need to operate under the Federal Advisory Commission Act, or FACA. They also noted in their op-ed is that they would work closely with the White House Office of Management and Budget. And as an alumnus of OMB and head of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, I think that's a wise choice. I think OMB is well suited both institutionally and also temperamentally to support the DOGE mission. They're accustomed to sparring with agencies who are likely to be resistant to reforms. And OMB is largely a career staff that brings deep knowledge of programs and regulations and a government-wide perspective that is unburdened by the tunnel vision that we tend to get in agencies. And they also share the DOGE mission of reducing inefficiencies and regulatory excess. They also have said they plan to crowdsource the ideas, which I think is a great idea and is going to be essential to doing that well. And they bring a tech savvy. So they talk about using advanced technologies to identify regulations that may be duplicative or outdated or based on questionable statutory authority. And that's a key part that I think we'll talk more with Nick and Chris about is that component, because they expect to be able to nullify thousands of regulations by their self-imposed deadline of 4th of July 2026, so a year and a half from now. And part of that is relying on the major questions doctrine from West Virginia v. EPA, and also the more recent Loper decision. So Nick, let me start with you. How realistic do you think that is? Your Atlantic article suggested that they've got the wrong mental model about what's wrong, and as a result, maybe they won't be as effective as they hope.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for including me in this teleforum. I really appreciate it. And I think it's a great moment to talk about regulatory reform. And as you said, I think there's a lot of reform that needs to happen. I think the big problem that I see with Musk and Ramaswamy's proposal is that it's not an especially realistic approach to pruning the regulatory state. So they seem to have the idea in mind that most regulations, or at least many regulations, are the product of overzealous bureaucrats who are reaching into domains where they have no business, where they've got no statutory authorization, and where their participation has not been blessed by Congress. And you can sort of understand why they tell that story, right? In a world with Chevron on the books, agencies could read ambiguous statutes in a way that allowed them to resolve ambiguities in a way that they preferred, and that sometimes allows them to reach out and decide things they wouldn't otherwise be able to decide. You can see, too, how the major questions doctrine is trying to push back on a perceived agency penchant for trying to regulate things they've got no business regulating. And so if you're thinking like, hey, Chevron and major questions doctrine, like if that's the place you start from, then you think like lots of the regulations on the books have got to be unlawful, and you can just redline them out pretty easily. The trouble is that Musk and Ramaswamy are just wrong about that. The problem with the regulatory state, to the extent that it's excessive regulations, the real scandal is not the regulations that are illegal. The real scandal is the regulations that are perfectly legal, that might be overdone or overwrought or insufficiently flexible or applied in a ham-handed manner. The fact is, Congress has delegated vast amounts of authority onto agencies to adopt regulations, and the vast majority of regulations on the books are squarely within agencies' authority, indeed are things that Congress wanted it to do. So the problem here is not that there are a bunch of illegal regulations. The problem, I think, is more that there are a bunch of regulations that they don't like. But getting rid of regulations you don't like requires you to go through a rulemaking process. And we all know from State Farm that that process requires you to justify a rescission of an old rule in the same way that you justify the adoption of an old rule. And that means you're going through the same cumbersome notice and comment process that all administrations struggle with, both to adopt and to rescind old rules. The other thing that's weird about their perspective about regulatory reform is that they seem to think that Loper-Bright and major questions doctrine give them new powers to kind of like sweep stuff off out of the Federal Register. But the opposite's the case. Both of those cases stand for the proposition that the courts are going to take a more assertive role in superintending what agencies do. That limits agency discretion. And that limit on agency discretion is going to make it harder for agencies to regulate, but it's also going to make it harder for agencies to deregulate, at least sometimes. So their mental model about regulatory reform seems to me off. And unless they've got some way to streamline the notice and comment process, which we should absolutely be looking to do, I think an 18-month time frame to achieve meaningful regulatory reform is extremely ambitious and very unlikely to be met.
Okay, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm excited about this project. I think that in theory, the idea of hiring a top flight consulting firm to come in for 18 months and examine a business that's doing a lot of good, but has a lot of excess and regulatory, red tape and other things that could be fixed. I mean, I just think that's a great idea in theory. Now, in practice, I'm probably where Nick is. I might share some skepticism that that this will actually work, just because it's new, it's different, and so far I haven't seen enough details to give me confidence that they know how they're going to navigate this. But on other issues, though, I disagree with Nick. I think that I love the framing of thinking about this in a kind of post-Loper-Bright major questions doctrine world. I don't disagree with Nick that a lot of regulations are like the best interpretation of a statute or don't implicate the major questions doctrine. But we've lived in 4 or 4 decades now of agencies regulating against the backdrop of Chevron, where you go up to the agency head and the general counsel's office if you work in the agency, and all you had to show is that your approach was reasonable and within the realm of a statutory ambiguity. And after Loper-Bright, that's just not the case anymore. It has to be the best interpretation of the statute. And so, unlike Nick, I think that implicates a lot of regulations that are aggressive or that aren't the most natural reading of a statute. And I do agree that if the only way to get rid of a regulation is through notice and comment rulemaking, that's not going to happen in 18 months. Although a lot of work could be done to set the agenda. I mean, I imagine they're going to have reports and the like, and they're going to let the president know what OMB can do and OIR can do from there to kind of channel that through. But there's a far faster way of getting rid of regulations that are unlawful. By here, I mean unlawful, inconsistent with Loper-Bright or the major questions doctrine. And that's to just not defend them in court. And I think that's going to be a tactic that it's used in every presidential administration at the end of a president when there's a transition. Interest groups will file lawsuits challenging regulations, and the new administration will then have the decision to make about whether they're going to defend that regulation, whether they're going to settle the case, or whether they're going to let a court decide that the regulation is unlawful. And I can imagine DOGE doing a lot of work there in helping to identify which regulations should be targeted, and helping to kind of have the public interest community and the industries kind of go after them. So I think that's part of what this program could be. Do I love that idea? I don't love the idea of not defending and settling regulations. It seems frustrating, but it is kind of part of how we go. I will just note on that front, that's not just new regulations anymore. Another important decision for this last term is corner post. And at least in some contexts, in corner post, it said that the 6-year statute of limitations that generally applies to challenges to rulemakings, it starts when the entity is harmed. In other words, you could create an entity today to challenge 30, 40, 50-year-old rules. And so I do think that the universe is a little bit broader. Now, lots of caveats there. There are lots of statutes, especially in the environmental context, that have shorter statute of limitations than the agency's organic statute. But I do think this does open up a pretty large world along those lines. I just want to kind of briefly, before I know we're going to get in the back and forth, but I did want to say, like, the one thing that I don't love about the rhetoric around DOGE is it shouldn't be about dismantling government. It should be about making government more effective. And that does involve cutting back on a lot of the regulatory red tape. And Nick and I don't always agree on getting rid of administrative process and other things, but I agree somewhat with him on that. We've got to streamline how agencies regulate. It definitely involves getting rid of regulatory restrictions that don't fit the current regulatory landscape. And so I kind of view this as a project. I wish they viewed it as a project of how do we make government effective? How do we make sure the government implements what Congress actually wants these federal agencies to do? And not just how do we make government not work at all? And I think if they have that type of approach, you might even see paying federal employees more in addition to firing the ones that aren't good. You might see actually hiring more federal agency officials in some contexts where you think it's important for effectiveness. And so I don't think it's just a deconstruction project for it to be really effective in making the federal government work better than it does today.
So, as the non-lawyer in this group on, challenges, so that you mentioned corner posts, which I think is a significant, especially in combination with these other recent cases with Loper. But in Loper, the majority opinion was explicit that this didn't cast into doubt previous decisions that had opinions that had deferred to agencies. So how would those new challenges work?
So, Nick, do you want to go?
I'm happy to take a stab at it. The answer is it'll depend. It'll depend on whether there is a pre-existing court decision about the meaning of a regulation or not. It'll depend on whether there are arguments that the plaintiffs or the petitioners can make to say that whatever existing case law is on the books, it didn't conclusively resolve the question. It's a strange passage in the Loper Bright case. It frankly feels pretty unprincipled, a sort of way of smoothing over real transition costs. And I appreciate the effort, but it does mean because it doesn't rest on a strong principled foundation that there's going to be a lot of fighting over exactly what it does or doesn't mean.
Yeah, I'd add to that it's, I mean, in the universe of regulations, it's a very small subset of regulations that a court is actually blessed as reasonable. And I'd actually go further and say it's a subset of just the Supreme Court. Because if it's a lower court, if it's a Fifth Circuit decision in Texas, you can just run to California and challenge it in the Ninth Circuit, and you won't have that stare decisis, constraint there. And so it really does, in my view, it really is only limited to Chevron Step 2 decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court, of which there are maybe 2 or 3 in the last 20 years. I mean, it's a very small universe. That's not what Chief Justice Roberts was trying to do in Loper Bright. He was trying to kind of bless every single Chevron decision across the administrative state. But just from a reality of how you litigate, you just go to a different circuit where you're not bound by that precedent. Or your favorite district judge in Texas, or maybe, I don't know what the next one will be in the Trump administration, Hawaii, and you get your nationwide injunction there. So I think that's kind of the dynamic there.
Well, and Chris, in a recent law review article, you also looked at how you talked to agencies, you interviewed agencies to see how were they using Chevron. Maybe talk to us a little bit more about that. Does that mean there'll be more or fewer cases that would likely fit within this model?
Yeah, I mean, so this was back, a while ago. This is when Chevron still was, I think, a pretty strong constraint in courts and at agencies. And, I asked them about, 24 different tools that they use when they're writing regulations, interpreting statutes. And not surprisingly, like the biggest winner was Chevron. I mean, that's the tool they knew the most and used the most. And when I tried to ask some follow-up questions, not as strong the results, but the kind of basic feel in the interviews and in the survey was that agencies are more aggressive when they know that Chevron applies in court, which shouldn't surprise us. I mean, if you know that you're more likely to win, you're going to be more willing to do things that are a little bit more aggressive. And I do think that's gonna change. It's one reason why it would be really hard to try to reconstruct a natural experiment to see if Loper Bright made a difference in courts, because it's going to make a difference at agencies in the sense that I think they are going to be more conservative. They're going to be making arguments about what the best interpretation of the statute is, which will limit some of their ability to go beyond that. But it'll be interesting to see, and this is where I think like something like DOGE is so important, is that agencies are very mission driven. They move in a particular direction with a lot of inertia. And it's very hard to get agencies to do like retrospective review of regulations. It's very hard. They have limited resources. They have Congress is telling them to do 5,000 things that would take $3 trillion, and they have $10 million to do them. And so it's hard to ask them to go back and reconsider old regulations. DOGE is something that can kind of come in and play that role and say, well, our consulting firms looked at all of your regulations, and here are some really big ones we think that aren't the best reading of the statute under Loper Bright. And here's some things OI or OMB that we'd encourage you to take a closer look at. So I think that's kind of when people say, oh, we don't need this. We've got agencies, we've got industry already kind of doing this. With all the inertia that happens at agencies, I really do think having an outside group like this, if it's effective and organized, can make a difference.
I'll push back on Chris's optimism that there are a bunch of sort of overly aggressive, legally vulnerable regulations on the books. It's true that that when you talk to agency officials, Chevron provides them with sort of a comfort blanket, and it gives them more room to be a little bit more assertive. But a portion of Loper Bright that doesn't get nearly as much attention as I think it should is a portion that says, listen, just because we're saying that we don't defer to agencies about questions of law, it doesn't mean that we don't that they don't have any discretion. There's lots of things that agencies have discretion to do that we will not second guess. So where the best reading of the statute is that there's a zone of discretion conferred on the agency. The courts won't interfere. And the Chief Justice said there are a couple of words that you see, like if you say like an appropriate sort of length of time or regulation or reasonable, like those are the kinds of things that bespeak an intent to delegate. So that just raises the question, okay, well, how many of these nominally Chevron decisions are decisions where an agency is acting within a zone of pretty clearly delegated authority, and how much of it is it really more closer to like a genuine bona fide legal interpretation? You can think of these as sort of like, when is an agency doing policy in its delegated domain, and when is it actually like doing law? My impression from what I've seen is that the category of things that agencies do that fall in the policy bucket dwarfs the number of things that agencies do in the legal bucket. That doesn't make the legal bucket unimportant, or that there aren't some regulations that you can wipe off the books because they rest on aggressive interpretations. But the vast majority of the regulations that are out there are not contestably unlawful under Loper Bright. They may just be bad regulations. The other thing I'll say is that if you want to get rid of a regulation because you think it's unlawful, the worst way to go about it is to say, we think it's unlawful, we're done. Because you're going to run into the DACA problem. That's exactly what the Trump administration did with DACA. They said, we think it's unlawful, and they withdrew it. Now, they had a pretty good legal argument for it being unlawful, but the Supreme Court didn't buy it. And so instead of just saying it's unlawful, it is a better, safer, sounder, more likely to be effective strategy to say, we think it's unlawful, and we think it's a bad idea. Here's why we think it's a bad idea. Here's why we think a different rule would be better. That's a big, long, complicated rulemaking process. And Loper Bright just does not help at all in that category.
So basically, Loper Bright doesn't get you around. You're saying it doesn't allow you to avoid going through that notice and comment rulemaking process.
Yeah.
That takes
Well,
time, and really often more than a year.
Another way
a
of
year and a
putting
half.
it is like how many of the challenges, or how many of the regulations in the books are kind of exercises like State Farm discretionary authority, and how many of them are exercises of Chevron legal powers? And my sense is the former category is just a whole lot bigger.
And that was something I found in the dissent as well, trying to understand, can we draw a clear line between what's policy and what's law? So
It's really
I think that can be
will be a
fascinating.
litigation provoking question, no doubt about it.
Chris, any thoughts on that before I kind of introduce some new subjects? And we're starting to get questions.
I mean, I would say I don't disagree with Nick that in the new world we're going to see everything restyled as agencies were delegated. The best interpretation of statutes, agencies have policymaking authority delegated to them. I don't think that stops, though. I don't agree that that's what all regulations are, though. I mean, in the environmental context, in one area you can see just a really aggressive reading of the Clean Air Act that I think a Trump administration with DOGE could really start to kind of peel back on, just to provide one example. And then you still have the context of you don't defend the regulation in court, and that's a weird dynamic. And we already have Roger Klein in the comments saying, well, what is going to be the role of interveners? And I would say it's going to play a very important role, as it always does when there's a change of presidential administration. But that's definitely going to be, part of that dynamic that you have going on in the courts.
Yeah, and people do start if you have questions, so you can put them in the Q&A tab, and we'll try to get to all of them. But before we go to Q&A, let's just talk about other ways. So we've talked about two ways that DOGE and the Trump administration could remove regulations or revise regulations. And one is obviously through the APA notice and comment rulemaking process. And the other is how they deal with challenges. So, how they enforce. Now, another thing that they talked about is that they can pause enforcement. Now, my interpretation of that is, yes, you can do that in the short run for a limited number while you go through that lengthy notice and comment rulemaking process. So let me pose that question to you. Another thing they can do is regulations that are in development. I'm sure that we'll see that as all new presidents, when they come in, their chief of staff often issues a memo on that on January 20th that says essentially stop the presses. So don't allow any regulations that are in the works to proceed until the new policy team. So they can definitely pause that. And the other thing we haven't talked about yet is the Congressional Review Act. So that is an opportunity for regulations, likely regulations that were have been issued and sent up to Congress after August 1st, is what the Congressional Research Service estimates. So regulations since August will likely be eligible for the next Congress to using simple, a simple majority vote. Each House of Congress could vote to disapprove the regulation. That joint disapproval, if it lands on the president's desk, it would be a new president, President Trump. He could sign them. He did that 16 times during his presidency, 14 times for regulations issued at the end of the Obama administration. And President Biden used that process to disapprove 3 of President Trump's. So I don't want to go down a CRA rabbit hole, but do you have comments on these other methods that we've heard? One is pause enforcement. Another one is using the CRA. Any thoughts on that before we go to Q&A?
Sure, I can talk about pausing enforcement. So this is sort of an idea that's drawn from a practice under both Obama and Trump of suspending the, I guess, legal enforceability of certain rules on the books. There's a powerful constitutional argument that that is unlawful, that it violates the president's duty to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And there's good case law to suggest that a blanket statement that you're not going to enforce a statute is potentially challengeable in court. Now, getting standing to challenge a non-enforcement directive may be a little bit tricky depending on the context. But nonetheless, I think that non-enforcement itself is legally vulnerable, more legally vulnerable than they anticipate. But the bigger problem with it is that it's just not very practically effective. So if you're a regulated entity, you've got compliance officers and compliance counsel running around telling you to comply with the laws and rules that are on the books. And often they tell you that because you have to represent to the federal government that you're in compliance with all federal laws and regulations for a variety of different purposes. That's especially true for financial institutions under Sarbanes-Oxley, but it's true for a wide array of regulated entities. And so if you see a non-enforcement order come out from DOGE or from the president, you think to yourself, that's nice, but they promise this rule is going to be rescinded in 18 months. I don't think they're going to hit 18 months. Maybe it'll be 2 years. Maybe it'll be 2.5 years. Maybe they'll lose interest. Maybe they'll get held up in court. Maybe they'll decide not to withdraw it. In the meantime, can we decline to comply? Well, because if we don't comply, we're still subject to potential enforcement actions when they lift this weird pause that they've put in place. Beyond that, like, we're not sure that we can certify that we're in compliance with all. So this airy promise that we're going to work to get these rules off the books probably won't do as much good to liberate corporations and businesses from the yoke of federal regulations as they'd like. I mean, again, it just goes to the point that in order to make change, you've got to do it right. You've got to do it in a way that sticks. And to the extent that Musk and Ramaswamy appear attracted to shortcuts, I think they're going to find that path blocked or less efficacious than they think.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, I do think I agree with Nick on it's not an effective approach for long-term change. But I do think, like, if you're thinking about enforcement policies that are over aggressive or not the best reading of a statute, or not, like, if it's not in a regulation, if it's just, it's very easy for an agency to announce, we read the statute. I mean, I can imagine in a world where the FTC, the politics aligned it a little bit differently than they do right now, because you got this kind of weird alliance on certain issues. But I could imagine a new FTC chair coming in and just saying, Chair Khan was just so far outside the bounds of what the FTC is supposed to be doing, the best interpreted statute, we're not going to do any of this stuff. We're not going to bring any of these enforcement actions. And if there's not a regulation in place that requires it, then that's fair game. It's not lasting change, as Nick's mentioned, but it is fair game to kind of set clear rules of the road. I don't think you can just blanket say I'm not going to enforce this regulation at all. Although, quite frankly, the Biden administration with Chair Gensler at the SEC did that with the proxy advisor rule. Had the enforcement staff say, we've decided not to enforce this because the chair has told us we're going to revisit the rule. Lawsuits were brought to kind of challenge that, but it's very, very hard, as Nick mentioned, to challenge non-enforcement actions. On the congressional review, I just note, like, briefly, I'm not really sure DOGE matters too much there. I think for reasons that, like, there's a limited set of major rules that are going to be subject to that, and industry and the White House already and the Hill already have a good sense of which one should go after. I think where DOGE will be more effective is on longer standing rules and agency practices and organizational features that just haven't been examined closely. So I hope they're not spending their time on the CRA. I mean, leave that to folks on the Hill to kind of and the transition team to deal with that.
All right, let me just do a couple follow-ups on both of those things. One, we have a comment from Greg Code in the chat on this first issue that we were just talking about. How will private rights of action? I mean, and that may just reinforce both of your point that it's hard just to pause enforcement because there are other. So would private rights of action make companies less likely to dare not comply?
Yeah, I mean, I think the courts, it's very hard to challenge an agency's decision not to enforce, as Nick mentioned. Like, it's almost near impossible. I do think the intervention route's a different route. Courts seem to be more willing to allow for people to intervene. I think also this Supreme Court isn't going to love the idea of not defending and settling. It's a loophole on the Administrative Procedure Act in the way of good governance. I don't think they'll be receptive to that if it makes its way up to the Supreme Court. So I expect that courts are actually going to rule on the legal merits and strike down regulations. Not that they're going to sue and settle. I just have a hunch that's just not going to go over well with the current court. I don't know, Nick, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the sue and settle approach makes the federal courts kind of snippy because it looks like an end run around State Farm and saying that you've got to work through, rescind a rule through the regular process. And it's a little like, throwing a fight. You get into the ring and you get punched, like slight brush to the jaw and you're down on the floor. Like you lose district court cases sometimes as DOJ. What are you going to do? Pretend it was a TKO? The courts kind of know what you're up to there. How they're going to deal with it, though, is another question altogether. I do brush up on your Rule 24 intervention practice. We're going to see a lot of late intervention, a lot of heroic efforts to get standing to intervene. So it's kind of a question about what the court continues to do with standing doctrine. I think Chris is right. They're going to be inclined to push back at least a little bit sometimes. But, I don't want to, I think Chris is correct, just diagnostically, that we're going to see a fair amount of you lose in court and then DOJ throws in the towel. And frankly, the administration's going to get away with that sometimes, maybe most of the time.
On the CRA, I think there are hundreds of regulations that are already in that window. And another thing that might be relevant is that a rule under the Congressional Review Act rule is rather broadly defined. And so sub-regulatory guidance that may not have already been sent to Congress, that may be an opportunity outside of this immediate first 60-day window of the new session.
Yeah, that's a really aggressive, creative. I see like David Crane has that in the comments of this idea, like there might be some old major guidance that could be CRA'd, and the clock doesn't start because it's never submitted to Congress. And that may all be true. I will say, if it's just guidance, the agency can also just get rid of it tomorrow, right? So I'm not really sure we have to go through the whole CRA and get Congress involved if DOGE and the president have already recommended that guidance be eliminated. That's stuff that can go away very quickly without notice and comment.
I'll just add on the guidance front, one of the sort of themes that you hear in this call, and I think with the DOGE in general, is that it's the idea that there are too many regulations or too much guidance, and it's just everybody's like burdened by all of this stuff that the government is doing. And there's doubtless some truth to that. But guidance in particular is often something regulated entities want, they ask for, they request, it gives them certainty. Upending a bunch of existing rules is often not good for business, both because businesses depend on rules to gain credibility with the like the community, like the food I'm selling is safe and it's not going to be contaminated, or this drug that I'm selling is both safe and effective. There are a lot of rules that actually serve business interests and a lot of guidance that serves business interests. So I think going back to the point that Chris made earlier, DOGE is a great opportunity to think about how to make government work better. The trouble is that it seems like the two people in charge of it want kind of to rip government up, to tear it down. And I think that's a missed opportunity. And I hope they rethink that approach. I hope they think that their job is to help build up and not just tear down. But I fear that they're coming at this kind of from the wrong end of the telescope.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, but let me just reinforce that businesses often like regulation, for some of the reasons you mentioned, but also because it provides a competitive advantage. And so you often will face resistance from regulated parties for trying to change them. Okay, I'm turning to the Q&A now, which Federal Society would like us to focus more on that and less on the chat. So I'm going to reward people who type things into the Q&A, starting with Jack Park. He says, you each say the new regime looks at the best reading of the statute. That's Justice Kavanaugh's proposal. Does that reading come from Loper-Bright, or is the rule a clear statement rule?
No, I love it. I mean, I view the whole framework in Loper-Bright, even though the Chief Justice wrote it, that's Justice Kavanaugh. I mean, the delegation, Loper-Bright delegation, that kind of whole new world is that, and I think I don't view it as a clear statement rule. I think that is probably more what I view the major questions doctrine as. I view it more as is the best reading of the statute that the agency has the delegated the authority to do policy making, or is the agency's interpretation of the statute the best reading if they're making a legal argument? And so I don't know. Do you see a clear statement rule there, Nick? I don't really see
No,
one.
they use the word, Loper-Bright uses that word express, that you have to have some kind of express delegated authority. And it's not exactly clear what the Chief Justice meant by express. Does it need to be explicit? Can it be implicit?
Footnotes, like that whole paragraph, like footnotes 4 and 5 or 5 and 6, it's fill up the details of the statute. That's not express. Or like open-ended terms. That's also not express.
I agree with you. I think that's the best way to understand. I also say that like judges, look, I mean, here's the dirty little secret about administrative law is like most of the cases are super boring, or at least super technical, and in a domain the judges don't know a whole lot about. And so the temptation to say, look, like, I don't know what the best rule for a backloader length time, like whatever, like they don't know. And more importantly, they don't care, right? Most administrative law issues do not get the judicial blood boiling. They don't raise the kind of provocative questions we tend to see on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, right? They are just the quotidian acts of day-to-day governance. And as to those, I don't think the Chief Justice or Justice Kavanaugh want to spend a lot of time digging into those kinds of details. And we'll be sorely tempted to say, look, there's a pretty broad domain where agencies just get to do what they've always done. So I'm part of the minority of administrative law scholars that think that Loper-Bright probably will not change all that much. But, that's a contested view, and I might be wrong.
All right. Here's a question from an anonymous attendee. What are the constitutional arguments against the Impoundment Control Act, which Musk and Ramaswamy raised in the Wall Street Journal article? And do you think those will be convincing to the Supreme Court?
I can take a quick run at that. So the Impoundment Control Act, of course, basically says you can't just impound money that Congress has appropriated. Congress has control of the purse strings. There is a kind of a novel constitutional claim that is being generated by folk in the conservative legal movement to sort of say the Impoundment Control Act infringes on the president's executive power. And that because it infringes on his executive power, it's therefore unconstitutional and the president can impound at will. I think there are like two big problems with this. The first is like, it's not clear to me that Musk and Ramaswamy, as a practical matter, actually want to impound any meaningful amount of money. You can impound money going to like some international organizations. Fine, right? They mentioned that in their op-ed, but it's trivial. It's chump change. Impounding real money will require you impounding money for like Medicare and Social Security. And they don't have, I think, the appetite or the political support to do that. They say we want to get at fraud, waste, and abuse, but every dollar of Medicare spending that's fraudulent, wasteful, or abusive is also a dollar of income to a really important constituent somewhere. So politically, it's really hard. But even if you get to I'm impounding serious amounts of money, the constitutional argument that's being built to defend the practice is thin to the point of vanishing. As an historical matter, there is no support for the notion that the president can simply ignore a command from Congress that the president must spend money. There's practices of presidents exercising discretion that Congress has given them, like to not spend money when they've had that discretion to choose or not to spend or not to spend. But notions that they can just like fly in the teeth of what Congress says are hard to stomach. And that's especially true given the baseline presumption that Congress's powers are really at its zenith when it comes to spending money, and especially when it comes to domestic spending. So, they can run the argument. I don't think the courts are going to buy it. The number of places where the courts have said the executive power sort of precludes Congress from acting, it's a very small category. It tends to be for things that touch on national security or foreign affairs, things where the president really does need some freedom of action. Domestic spending is just, I think, pretty far from that very narrow category. So Congress, like usually, is going to get to set the rules. That's my read. Maybe Chris is more optimistic about those constitutional arguments.
No, I don't want to. But I do want to shift a little bit here. And Susan, you in one of your op-eds, you also hit on this. Like, an effective DOGE isn't just going to report to the president. Effective DOGE should also work with Congress. And so I view this a lot more. I mean, right now they're in the op-eds, kind of fleshing out their vision and strangely going into a lot of detail. Whoever they have, whatever lawyers working on this stuff is really good at administrative law. But the reality is like they're setting a vision for this 18-month project, and any vision for this project really needs to include Congress as one of the constituents. And I think also, Susan, and you might want to add to this, I also think that the more nonpartisan or bipartisan it can be, the better. In other words, there are effective advocates. I think in your op-ed you mentioned like Heidi Heitkamp, former senator. Like those are folks that have been working for years on making government more effective and reducing regulatory restrictions. And I think those are also like would be a really effective way to kind of make this project actually work on the ground. I don't know, Susan. I feel like I'm just repeating your op-ed, but I like it. I think you're right.
That was actually an earlier Forbes piece before I'd seen what Musk and Rami were saying. And I said, you really could have like a BRAC commission and bring together this. So then you could have bipartisan agreement and maybe bring everybody along. I mean, we saw that. And now I'm old enough to remember the late 70s, early 80s, where there was bipartisan agreement on how we could make regulations less burdensome. I don't know if we have any hope of that again. Nick, did you want to say something on that?
I actually wanted to throw it back to you. I think one of the important partners here is not only Congress. I think Chris is right. I think the fact that Musk and Ramaswamy seem to be disinterested in working with Congress is going to be a real weakness of DOGE. It's especially weird because Republicans will control the House, the Senate, and the White House. It seems like a missed opportunity. But the other major partner they're going to have is OMB. And of course, you are vastly more familiar than either Chris or I about the role that OMB might play here. And I think it's important to bring that out. I sometimes am tempted to say that DOGE is sort of the flashy, sort of attention-getting tip of the spear, but the real workhorse here is going to be OMB, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs on the regulatory side, and of course, the budget, the budget examiners and the management team. So I think every part of OMB will probably be involved. Yeah, and I think they do recognize that, or at least, I mean, they explicitly mentioned that in their op-ed. Well, as Chris pointed out, they also explicitly said they didn't need Congress, that they were going to do things through executive action only. Yeah, so I mean, OMB is a small, lean office, but I do think they'll be instrumental in making this work. We've got several more questions, and I'm going to try to quickly get at them. So Eric, if you don't want us to say your name, type that in your question. Otherwise, I will acknowledge you. Eric Hygus says, Professor Bagley mentioned that not enforcing statutes would raise faithful execution separation of powers concerns. Does that also apply to an executive branch regulation based on a statute that gives an agency discretionary rather than mandatory authority? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure I track the question. I think if an agency has discretionary authority, then the question about faithful execution will be, is it exercising that discretion consistent with its best view of policy and the law? If it were to say, I just don't like this law, I prefer not to exercise my discretion one way or the other, that could raise faithful execution problems. But I think otherwise, look, and to be realistic, unless you get one of the reasons that I think this non-enforcement thing is not really gonna go anywhere is that you don't need to make a blanket statement of non-enforcement in order to effectively communicate that this is not going to be a priority. So I don't think you're going to get a lot of lawsuits in this space. Take care lawsuits are notoriously, it's not clear you can even enforce it in court. But so I don't think the risk of judicial invalidation is especially high in this context, but I also don't think you need to go that far in order to achieve your objective.
I would just add briefly, if the question was like, if it's a regulation, not a statute, is it a lack of faithful execution not to enforce the regulation? And I think the answer still is yes, unless you go, because the Administrative Procedure Act requires you go through notice of
Yeah, I agree with that.
So if that was the question, I think you got to rescind it through the proper procedure in order to not have to follow it anymore.
Okay, another question from Gregory Court. How will DOGE's ambitions for spending cuts factor into this? Would deep cuts to regulatory agencies help or hinder their regulatory agenda? Now, we've all talked about if you do have to go through notice and comment rulemaking, you're going to need the agencies to develop a robust record that can be defend challenges in court. What do you both think about that question?
I think you answered it, Susan. I mean, if you're going to want to undo this, you're going to have competent, well-resourced folks to go through those and comment. Now, I could imagine, a couple of different areas. Strangely, they cut in different directions. But on the enforcement side, you could imagine hollowing out enforcement, the enforcement divisions of agencies, and that having the effect of obviously not as much enforcement. On the flip side, though, if what you care about is permitting, you probably actually have to increase authority there. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic of, and that's why I like the question is like the cost cutting doesn't really necessarily lead to even more effective deregulatory government. And I view permitting as deregulatory in a way, right? Because it's allowing more market participation.
I'll follow up on what Chris said. I totally agree. But I think one of the things that the Musk and Ramaswamy op-ed framing kind of makes me like once you kind of strip away a little bit of the attitude, some of the distinct legal moves, this op-ed could basically have been written, at the beginning of the Reagan administration. In fact, it was written at the beginning of, like we had exactly the same moves about unelected bureaucrats exceeding their legal powers and burdening industry. And the idea animating a lot of those Reagan era ideas was let's get rid of a bunch of rules, liberate the free market, make the federal government small enough that we can strangle it in the bathtub, or whatever the phrase was. And I think that project has failed. And I think it's failed for an important reason, which is that, 45 years on, it's totally clear that there's huge demand for regulations of lots and lots of entities out there, and many for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons. But the demand for regulation isn't going to go anywhere. The permitting for big projects isn't going to go anywhere. If you want to be an effective business in the United States, you got to find a way to work with and accommodate yourself to government. And so what I think, what I'd like to see is a shift to say, how can we make government work better? Because an effective, nimble, lean government is good for business, and an ineffective, sclerotic, timid government is bad for business. I'd like to see that shift happen. And I don't think I've seen that pivot from DOGE yet, but I do think that would be really productive to get out of the mindset that what we need to do is tear down, and to get back into the mindset that like government isn't going anywhere. Let's find a way to work with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not old enough to say I was a Reagan regulatory reform person, but I am a Reagan regulatory reform person. And I don't agree. I mean, I agree government needs to be more effective, but it needs to be much smaller. And like the deregulatory mission of the Reagan administration, I thought was like hugely successful in reframing. I mean, the cost benefit analysis revolution that came out of Reagan has made sure that we don't have as many crazy rules that have all these unintended consequences and excessive costs that aren't justified by the benefits. And so I'd like to see a lot more of that. But I will say, like, when I read the op-ed, I felt like this was just a repackaging of like a Boyd and C. Gray, Reagan project. And that's why I'm excited about it. But I'm not sure. I'm not confident it's going to work. But I do think that if it is going to work, I maybe my take's the opposite of you, Nick. Is it really does have to channel those really entrepreneurial lawyers and policymakers in the Reagan administration that did those kind of major deregulatory reforms.
And I'd like to just give Jimmy Carter some credit too, because he really did start, and even before him, Ford before him started some of that deregulatory approach. So deregulation, regulatory reform were not dirty words back then by either party. So we've got a question in here about could DOGE be most effective by focusing on easily rescindable guidance rather than official rules? And I think that gets maybe a little bit to the CRA. Certainly that would be a way to have Congress overturn things. And when a rule is overturned or disapproved under the Congressional Review Act, the agency cannot issue anything substantially similar, which could have disadvantages for a guidance document if you just wanted it to be clear or something that may not be. But the other thing we haven't talked yet about is that Trump has recently said that he plans to eliminate 10 rules for every new one introduced. So this is an upping the game from what he did. It was 2 for 1 in the last administration or last Trump administration. Now, what he did there, and this was again OMB, to Nick's point about OMB's role, OMB made that 2 for 1 promise something that was manageable by saying the one new one is we only count significant regulatory actions, whereas the outs, the ones that you're removing, that could be a guidance document, it could be an information collection, a lot of sub-regulatory actions counted as outs. And so in the end, they said that they actually achieved 27 to 1. And I don't think that's bad. I don't think that's a bad way. I think it was a wise way to have done it then, because I think it does get agencies focusing on things that might not be the biggest ticket, exciting things, but things that actually matter to people. He also, before he had, in addition to the 2 for 1, his executive order had a net zero budget, and he hasn't talked about that yet. But anyway, that's a long beginning answer to Gabriel Green's question about rescindable guidance. Do either of you have more to add to that one?
I mean, I guess I'd love to know which guidance is stopping businesses from flourishing. I mean, I'm super, and if it is, you could just ask the new administration to get rid of it, and they probably will. I don't know. I'm somewhat skeptical that guidance is really part of the major answer here. I mean, maybe there are specific regulatory areas I'm not an expert on where there's some big guidance that is a big problem, but my
Yeah,
sense.
I've heard that in the banking sector, the bank examiners rely on guidance that never went through notice and comment to find all kinds of violations for banks. So it may be, but you're right, you don't really need the CRA for that, but maybe DOGE could
Yeah.
do
You know,
that.
one interesting thing about that I just flag is rulemaking. There used to be, when we had Chevron, an incentive to do it because you got Chevron deference, and with guidance you didn't. And now I think there are kind of weird incentive shifts on that front. Like, why go through rulemaking if your tweet gets the same amount of deference as your 3,000 page notice and comment rule?
Yes, I've heard others make that point too, that it may actually make APA rulemaking used less and that you see more guidances and things. Now, I see Marie, we're running out of time. We've got 4 minutes left. Marie, there's I could ask one question that combines a couple. Should I do that before we sign off? And maybe the answer is from all of us no, but there are questions about, are there specific targets that that you think DOGE should tackle?
I would love, look, I don't think this is going to happen. But I focus a lot of my work on the healthcare sector and think a lot about Medicare in particular. And there are a lot of ways in which Medicare pays much more than it needs to for all sorts of medical care. We pay way more for drugs under Part B than we ought to. And there's actually a lot of regulatory authority on the books that would allow somebody like people like Musk and Ramaswamy to really think hard about how can we get, better outcomes or as good of outcomes at a cheaper price. I think unless and until I see them doing something like that, I'm going to take all of their budgetary claims with a big grain of salt because, like looking for money under the couch cushions isn't going to make a meaningful dent in the federal debt. But, starting to make some changes to Medicare, that adds up real fast.
Yeah, I mean, the benefits area, if you're trying to cut costs, are where the costs could be cut. I'm not sure that though fits with the larger project of trying to make government work more effectively or kind of streamline government. I would throw out like anything on the permitting front or on the approval front is one where
Second that.
that whether that's drugs or project infrastructure projects, or I mean, I think that's one area that I hope they spend a fair amount of attention on.
Well, we're out of time and we still had questions, so apologies to those that we didn't address.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Walker and Professor Bagley, for sharing your points of view. And thank you to Professor Dudley as well for moderating this discussion. For more content like this on the regulatory state, please visit us at regproject.org. That is regproject.org. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to the audience as well.